Warden! Warden! Guards! Help us! Daisy screamed as she violently shook the bars of the cell she shared with Pat. She had woken with a start when she felt a sticky fluid dripping from the bunk on her face. In a half-sleepy state, she had wondered what it was. It took a minute to realize it was blood from her bunkmate. In the most gruesome manner, Pat had slit her wrist with a too-blunt knife. The guards' steps made heavy thuds that echoed through the prison walls as they rushed in to save Pat. She caught a pitiful picture laying on the too-hard mattress of the dispensary. She was now on a suicide watch. Her skin ashy and hanging loosely on her now too bony frame. Eyes, which once shone in excitement, were dull with no spark of life in them. Wrists heavily bandaged, she lay motionless, staring at the gray wall. She had lost all hope. The episode in the afternoon was the final straw for her. The constant bullying since she was incarcerated was unbearable for her. She had been an easy target. She stood out amongst the prisoners. Her good upbringing, polish, and years of formal education made her a sitting duck. She did not belong, and fellow inmates quickly showed her how much. She wasn't physically strong enough to protect herself. She didn't possess the sexual appeal to buy her protection from stronger inmates or guards. She had just served 90 days of her 10-year jail term without parole. You piece of shrink, you think you're better than us? Susan, the feared prison bully, had yelled at her on her first day while hurling racial slurs at her. Her startling blue eyes emanated so much hatred, Pat felt herself physically shrink. Susan was huge, tall, hefty, with badly tattooed sleeves on both arms. Her formerly blonde hair was dyed red in a poorly done prison job. Susan, since then, has made it her life's mission to make her miserable. Pat's meals were an atonement offering at meal times. She only ate the remnants Susan deemed fit to leave her, which was most times nothing. The rumbling of her belly from hunger was a familiar sound. Her ulcer symptoms worsened. Her roommate Daisy sometimes snuck her some food as she worked kitchen duties, but that could barely keep her alive. The hunger she could endure, beatings and verbal abuse were other degrees of torture. She became a shadow of herself in a month. Her prison garb became even more ill-fitting. The first incidents of physical abuse had surprised Pat and shocked her to the marrow. It was during recess. She had walked by Susan and murmured a timid hello, hoping to hurry past. Although luck was not on her side, Susan looked up and called her over. Susan had spat in her face, calling her a bitch. Reeling from the humiliation, she had challenged Susan, asking that Susan accorded her basic human decency. That earned her multiple slaps and smacks across the head. It had continued until she could no longer feel her face. She was saved by the dinner bell going off. Nothing prepared Pat for prison. Disregard of the guards, the way they pretended not to notice the bullying of imprisonment. Susan rudely yanked her out of her reverie, pulling her kinky hair. She had been daydreaming about her days at college after Susan had again snatched her food. The searing pain that followed blinded her for a minute as hot tears slipped down her cheeks. The successive kicks and slaps that followed had her doubled over. She curled into the feline position she was used to adopting during the beatings. She welcomed the pain, embraced it even. Perhaps it was perchance for some sin in her immediate past. This was different. It would seem like Susan was hell-bent on tearing her down this time. When physical beatings weren't doing the trick, she took to racial slurs and verbally assaulted her. Her breakfast and dinner the night before had been taken from her. Daisy had been removed from kitchen duty and could not sneak her any meal. The inmates were given 2 hours for leisure after lunch. This was when her worst nightmare came to life. Pat sat alone in a corner in the library, poring over her favorite book, The Great Gatsby. She looked up to see Susan with her gang of minions surrounding her. She had thought the daily dose of torture was over after the lunch episode. They dragged her to Susan's cell, where they took turns sexually assaulting her with cutlery and dirty fingers, leaving bite marks all over her. They were rough, violent, cruel, and demeaning, taking out all the anger and frustrations of prison on her. After their fill of her, she was left bruised and crying on the floor. She crawled to her room on all four, broken. The event left her so impure that she had 3 showers in the space of an hour, scrubbing until she bled. Yet she felt unclean. She had stared at the knife she stole off one of Susan's minions during the assault, hoping to protect herself next time, till slitting her wrist seemed more like welcome recompense. Pat let herself wander in her mind. It was the only way she had learned to deal with the pain. She was in the deep recesses of her mind where she couldn't feel, where the taunts and jeering didn't matter, where she was yet still an executive. A 45-year-old top executive at the audit firm of Gray and Castle, Pat did not look a day above 35. She was always immaculately dressed and looked well put together regardless. She was in no way a ravishing beauty in a conventional manner. Even in her youthful bloom, she was, however, a uniquely attractive woman. Towering at 5'8", she was a tall woman with a slender figure that made younger women green with envy. Her dark, ebony skin shining like fine porcelain, combined with her pleasant disposition, gave the illusion of a glowing onyx. Her eyeballs, too extensive for her narrow face, gave the startling appearance of a Barbie doll. Her mouth was permanently set in a slight pout, looking ready to break into a smile at any point. The tiny nose that appeared to be stuck as an afterthought completed the look. The overall appearance was striking. Her life was the American dream. She was the first generation to go to college and graduated top of her class. She was recruited at a college job fair before graduation. She rose rapidly through the ranks at work and was a shining example to junior colleagues. A 3-time Employee of the Year. The world was at her feet until it wasn't. It was a Monday like any other. She had gotten to work punctually, ready to kick off the day. Men in suits and uniformed men were in her office. In a split second, in what still seems like a bad movie, her Miranda rights were read to her. The days that followed were a blur. She was charged with defrauding the firm of $1 million. All her assets were seized, her accounts frozen. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She couldn't believe they were talking about her. Even her counsel didn't believe her. He only did his job as ethics demanded. It was an open and shut case, or so they said. She didn't stand a chance. It all seemed like a dream anyway until the jury gave a guilty verdict. She got 10 years without parole. Her appeal was thrown out just as quickly. She was condemned. "You have a visitor," the guard announced, even as she stared at the wall. That was a first. No one had visited her since her incarceration. Pat wasn't one to keep many friends, and the few she had since forsaken her. An only child, she had no family. Her parents, black immigrants with little education, had decided to have only one child they could adequately cater to. Pat's mother had died of breast cancer 3 years after her graduation. The cancer was already advanced, with lung metastasis long before it was diagnosed. The palliative care had been a long, torturous journey that took its toll on the family. Seeing her free from the pain and endless suffering, Pat was relieved when she died. Yet the void her death left could not be filled. Pat had been devastated. She was pretty close to her mom. She had thrown herself at her work with a vengeance then. Her father found solace in the bottle after his wife's death. He died a year later from a car crash while driving under the influence. Now Pat was alone in the world. Her curiosity won over her reluctance. She was tempted to refuse to see whoever the visitor was, but eventually decided against it. Dave paced the waiting room, questioning his decision to be there. He wasn't friends with her. They were mortal enemies at work. The reason wasn't far-fetched. It was a cutthroat firm. Being peers, they always competed for raises, promotions, or clients. Since her incarceration, he had almost everything on a platter. He missed it, though. The competition kept him sharp. He had heard about her attempted suicide and decided to visit. He wasn't sure how she would react. Dave had gone to a community college, which he could only afford because he got an athletic scholarship. He slightly begrudged her the privilege of attending an Ivy League school. He had always had to pull himself up by the bootstrap. Part of their rivalry stemmed from his need to prove himself better than her. Pat was shocked to see Dave. He was the last person she expected to see. They weren't even friends. There was an initial awkward silence. Yet it was a relief to see a familiar face, and Pat soon opened up about her prison ordeal. Walking out of the prison, Dave swore to unravel the mystery behind the missing fund. Dave hired a private investigator to look into the case discreetly again. It took a whole month and lots of effort. Eventually, the truth was revealed. Pat was set up. Jessica was a junior colleague mentored by Pat at work. Pat took her under her wing, determined to make her succeed. Jessica remained mediocre at work, She blamed it on Pat rather than her bad habits of laziness and procrastination. She believed her good looks alone would be enough to get by in life. Pat's insistence that she made the right things, cultivated better habits, and did not slack off at work was a personal affront. She secretly hated Pat and secretly plotted her downfall. She pretended to be under Pat's tutelage while she bided her time. Her opportunity came soon enough. A Fortune 100 firm they had worked with had her external audit, and Pat was the auditor on the job. Jessica begged be assigned the same duty. Jessica was close enough to Pat while working on the project to forge the documents and get her signature and official detail. In light of new evidence, the case was reopened. Jessica was charged and convicted. Pat was acquitted and compensated for her loss. Inhaling fresh air outside of the prison gates felt surreal. The damages she received from the lawsuit were enough for her to live a comfortable life now. It was time to explore the world, smell the roses, and to be free. She could look forward to tomorrow again. Like a phoenix, she has risen from the ashes. She had started therapy sessions. She was finally able to get over her prison ordeal. Pat and Dave developed a friendship that blossomed into a relationship. Theirs was a bond forged pain and hardship. Together, they established an advocacy group, Prison Reform.
Muffin arrived at the school later than the others. She was undergoing a challenging course of treatment. For several years, was homeschooled. By this time, the children at the school had managed to become friends. The class developed their relationship, and the first love couples appeared. Brian was in love with Emma and sometimes walked her home. Paul was inseparable from Anna. Steve spent a long time unsuccessfully courting the class's top hottie, Sophia. However, all the boys loved Sophia, even from other classes. She was beautiful, blonde, with green eyes. Sophia was not very successful in her studies, although she was very successful with the boys. She was the recognized queen of the class. On that day, two students, Muffin and Fred Crane, came to the school. Fred immediately attracted the attention of the entire class. A humble guy with dark hair and a friendly smile, whom both teachers and girls and even boys liked. He was well-versed in all the lessons, was polite, friendly, and did not participate in conflicts. He treated all warmly and affably. Surprisingly, he did not pay much attention to the beautiful Sophia. The queen of the class is accustomed to the increased awareness of boys. She wondered why the new Fred was friendly to Lisa, Stephanie, and Judy. He treated Sophia like everyone else, warm, kind, and nothing more. In the beginning, Muffin didn't even attract the students' attention. Everyone was busy discussing Fred's appearance and preparing for Stephanie's party. Muffin was sitting next to Fred. Two new students sat together, but did not pay attention to each other. It is not surprising that no one remembered Muffin. No one knew her name, although teachers approached her. A lumbering body, fat legs, thick cheeks, and colorless hair. That's what the new girl looks like. She didn't bother anyone, answered the teacher's questions, and didn't talk to anyone. The nickname, Muffin, stuck to her at once. No one remembered that the colorless girl was called Heather. She did not interest anyone. Soon it turned out that Heather had unpleasant breathing. When she was anxious or rushing, she began to breathe unnaturally. The girl put a tube in her mouth during the attack, restoring her breath. This caused her to be squeamish. She was called a muffin because of her loose body and plump face. At first, everyone was indifferent to her. Her classmates simply did not notice her. The situation escalated when it became clear that Fred was sympathetic to Heather. No, he was not in love with her. It was impossible to fall in love with a loose, colorless creature with unpleasant breath. But he treated her well. The girl could easily share her school supplies if Fred didn't hear the assignment. Some topics that Heather didn't understand, Fred could explain to her. It wasn't friendship, but relations with her desk mates were good. The beginning of the feud was Sophia. A pretty girl in the class could not forgive an ordinary girl for the attention of a good guy. One day, Sophia offered Fred to sit next to her in class, but the guy refused. He politely replied that he had arranged with Heather to do a joint project. Beauty harbored evil. From that moment on, Heather was no longer just an unremarkable girl. She became the true enemy of the class queen. You can't say that Sophia was madly in love with Fred, but the friendly guy turned out to be inaccessible to her. He was not under the spell of the beauty. He communicated with Sophia just as he talked to Stephanie, Anna, Emma, and even Muffin. One day, the first unpleasant situation occurred. That day, Sophia was in a perfect mood. She was wearing a bright red sweater and blue jeans. These clothes suited the girl very much. The beauty had a good mood. On this day, she was in the mood to joke about Heather. "What is it?" said Sophia, and she poked Heather's backpack with a delicate finger. The girl looked timidly at the queen of the class. She did not understand what the angry beauty wanted from her. Sophia squeamishly poked her knapsack with her fingernail. "It's mud," she said, ringing and laughing. The other guys were laughing too. "That's not dirt," said Heather quietly. "There you go, mud. It's like dough." Sophia kept laughing. Her beautiful eyes were shining. The laughter was ringing. At that point, she was more beautiful than usual. "Bread dough." Steve laughed angrily. Everyone liked the joke so much that laughter filled the audience. Heather became worried and began to breathe heavily. She was depressed and hurt. Fred did not laugh with everyone, but did not stand up for the girl. When Heather began to suffocate, Sophia began to intimidate her. She stuck out her tongue and began to breathe loudly. The guys started to laugh even more. "Dough for Muffin! Dough for Muffin!" said Steve. The other guys started shouting that phrase too. Fred got a little confused. He was uncomfortable with the situation. Fred felt terrible for Bread, but could not stand up to the whole class. He thought he should have supported the poor girl, but he didn't know how to help her. Fred was scattered over the books on his desk. The girl got better. Soon the lessons began. Fred couldn't concentrate on the task. He thought Heather was mad at him. "She'll probably never talk to me again," the guy thought. He didn't know if it was good or bad. Sometimes he regretted getting so close to Muffin. Befriending an outcast girl robbed him of many joys. But he couldn't break up with her. Somehow she touched his heart. Muffin was very different from the other girls of that age. She was kind and understanding. She made him feel comfortable. Like the other boys at school, Fred liked Sophia very much, but something about Heather made her tender and made him want to take care of her. He didn't want to take care of Sophia. Fred sat the whole lesson and did not look at Heather, but at the end of the study, he felt her hand touch his elbow. "Fred, I've lost my pencil. Can you give me yours?" Heather whispered. A wave of relief came over Fred. He was happy that the girl had found a reason to talk to him. He gladly gave her a pencil and crossed her eyes. Heather was smiling. He wanted so much to do something for her, and soon he had an opportunity to do something good for her. Unfortunately, good intentions have come to naught. There was a lot of talk in class about Stephanie's party. A classmate was gathering guests at her house for the weekend. Her parents left town and let her daughter call her friends. Stephanie gave everyone a bright invitation card. Muffin and Fred got invited too. Heather was holding a colorful card. Fred heard the girl sigh. "Do you want to go?" he asked the neighbor with a smile. "No, of course," said Heather sadly. "Why?" said Fred. In his head, he scolded himself for asking. He understood that the gentle, shy girl with her appearance should not have come to the party. There were going Sophia, Emma, and Anna. These are real sharks that could hurt vulnerable Heather. At the same time, Fred understood how much she wanted to have fun. After all, this has never happened in her life. Perhaps she wanted to wear a beautiful dress and have fun with friends. She just did not have any good friends, and she deserved fun and some friends. "Come with me," Fred asked the girl, looking into her eyes. Heather's cheeks were covered with blush. She looked at the boy with huge, colorless eyes, with wonder and hope. At that moment, she was almost beautiful, but after a second, the hope in her eyes disappeared. The girl mentally returned to reality. "Thanks, Fred. I'm not going," said Heather, pretending to read. The boy felt a strong desire to make the girl happy. He thought that if Heather came to this party, the guys would see her qualities. They would appreciate her kindness and sincerity. He determined to help Heather. "You're coming with me, and it's out of the question," said Fred firmly. And then he added, "I want you to wear the most beautiful dress. Do you have one?" "Yes, actually," said Heather with a happy smile. Sometimes she was invited to holidays, but when she refused, no one insisted or talked her into it. On that day, Stephanie Adams' house was full of young guests. Loud music was playing. Sophia came in a bright green dress. It was very shining in her emerald eyes. The figure of the girl was great. The guys looked at her shapes with lust, but she did not pay attention to anyone. Sophia had a clear plan to get close to Fred. She was sure that the obstacle to their love was Heather. He spent so much time with an unattractive, ugly, pity girl from a pitiful school. There was simply no way to communicate with Fred without her in class. Today is a great chance because there will be no ugly muffin next to him, thought Sophia. She was beautiful today. Sophia was sure that Fred would come. He was a little late. The guys were all gathered and making a lot of noise. Sophia looked at the door. She was waiting for Fred. No one was expecting what happened next. Amid the fun, Fred entered the house. He was wearing a suit that suited him very well. He was holding Heather's hand. All the guys looked at the strange couple with surprise. The muffin looked strange. The dress was beautiful, but not very good for a total girl. The makeup was not on her. Her hair was neat and attractive, but colorless. Heather smiled affably. Her smile was timid. Stephanie was surprised, but invited the guests to join the company. The first half hour was good. Everyone continued to do their business. At first, no one noticed the queen of Sophia's class was in a bad mood. Fred never left her side, serving her drinks and sandwiches. He even tried to involve a shy girl in the conversation. It was time to dance. Fred was going to invite Heather, but Sophia was cleverly ahead of him. She went up to the guy and asked him to dance. Heather nodded timidly. The whole dance, Sophia snuggled up to the boy. He liked her. He didn't want to turn into a timid admirer of the entourage of the recognized queen. Fred mentally noted how beautiful Sophia was today. She was so temptingly snuggled up to him. He did not notice that the dance was over and the next song began. In the second slow song, he danced with beautiful Sophia. At the end of the second dance, he thought he did not want to return to Heather. He even regretted taking her with him on such a day. She prevented him from having fun with her presence. He could dance and have fun with the beautiful Sophia. Instead, he had to take care of Heather. Fred apologized to Sophia and went to Heather. Steve approached the beauty. He had long been in love with Sophia, but resentful, Sophia pushed the guy away. "Can't you see that your Fred is stuck to a muffin? He doesn't want you," he said to Sophia. This was the humiliation the girl could not stand. Sophia jumped up to Heather and yanked her arm, screaming, "Why did you come to this party? You were not expected here. You are an ugly, stupid creature." All the guys began to look at what would happen next. Heather looked at the furious beauty. Sophia continued, "You're ruining everyone's life. Scary people like you should stay at home and not go to cool parties." Heather got excited. She started to breathe heavily. Fred helped her take the medication to help her live. He gave her the tube. All the guys were looking at him. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't respond to Sophia rudely. He didn't want to take care of Heather anymore. She was really in his way. She was a stranger at the party. But Fred wasn't mad at himself for bringing a girl with him. He was angry with her. She was breathing so severely, her ugliness didn't even save a beautiful dress. Heather's breath was back to normal. What happened next surprised everyone. Heather got up, looked at everyone with colorless eyes, and said quietly, "You're all evil, cruel people here. I came here only because of Fred. He is the only kind and noble man among you. I will leave, and he will leave with me. I am happy at your school because I met this guy. He is not like you. When we graduate, he will be married and have many beautiful, intelligent, kind children." At first, they listened to her in silence, but at the end of her speech there was laughter. Sophia burst out. Her laughter was loud and contagious. Then Steve and Stephanie and the other guys started laughing. Fred was silent. The guys weren't just laughing at Heather, they were teasing him too. They mocked him because of Muffin. Fred jumped up and yelled at Heather, "Shut up! Shut up! You are a stupid, disgusting creature. Shut up! I only brought you here because I felt sorry for you. Look at you. You're ugly and stupid." Heather fell silent in fear. Then her breathing became uneven again. She was helping herself breathe the drug, but it was no longer helping. The girl began to suffocate. At first, everyone laughed at her situation. The shortness of breath of a fat girl looked funny. Someone even mimicked her. Emma was the first to notice that Heather had become quite ill. She called the ambulance. An emergency came quickly, but the girl was already unconscious. Heather was taken away to hospital. No one knew what happened next with Heather. The next day, she didn't come to school. She didn't go to school with the guys anymore. No one even talked about Muffin anymore. It became taboo. All the guys understood they were involved in something terrible. The years passed, and everyone slowly forgot about the colorless girl. Fred and Sophia became a couple. After graduation, they married. Sophia was a demanding girl, and her young husband did not have enough money for her desires. She constantly talked about him finding a job. The relationship between the couple was not always perfect. The young wife was scandalous and capricious. Soon, Sophia came home with flaming eyes. The prestigious company was recruiting young employees. Sophia forced Fred to submit his resume. The girl sent her resume too. Working in a prestigious company was very well paid. If they could both get a job at the office of this organization, they could buy a house right away. Unfortunately, no one replied to their CVs. Sophia wrote letters to the organization, but the company sent them a polite refusal. After a month, a persistent girl still managed to get a meeting with the head of the company. Sophia was convinced that she and Fred were skilled professionals. She believed that ordinary people were mistakenly refusing them. At the interview, Sophia and Fred came together. The organization was located in a beautiful building with modern renovations. The guys were taken to a luxurious office to the head. A beautiful young woman in an elegant costume offered Fred and Sophia a gesture to sit down. Something subtly familiar was on her face. "My name is Heather Donnelly. I am listening to you," said the lady. The name also seemed familiar to the guys. Sophia immediately presented the documents and began to tell the company director about their capabilities. She spoke for herself and her husband. Fred was silent. Sophia said a lot. Heather Donnelly listened to her attentively. "Why are you so silent?" said Fred's lady with a smile. With that smile, she turned everything upside down on him. He recognized Muffin. But how did she change? She became subtle, graceful. It was an impossible change for her. The face was hers, but at the same time completely different. She had a lovely look with expressive blue eyes. Her hair was blonde in a sharp bundle. Fred was struggling to breathe. Heather Donnelly asked anxiously, "Are you all right, Mr. Crane? Are you having trouble breathing? Should I call our doctor?" Fred shook his head negatively. His breathing was still heavy. Sophia was displeased that her husband looked so ridiculous at the time. "I had an asthma medication with me years ago, but I don't need it anymore. So if it's hard for you, I can call our doctor. Unfortunately, I don't have any medicine with me," the manager continued. Fred refused help. He was distraught. He remembered everything. He remembered the naive, ugly Muffin. He remembered how Sophia was torturing her. He remembered betraying a quiet, humble girl. "Heather," he whispered. The wife glanced at Fred angrily, and at that moment, she also got struck. Sophia's face turned red. "Muffin," she whispered. Heather smiled with restraint. "Yes, we know each other, and now, unfortunately, we do not need specialists for your profile. Our staff is already sufficiently staffed. We hired employees with higher qualifications, but you were so persistent, I can only offer you a position of service staff, but I think you will decline." Sophia's eyes flashed with anger. "Of course we won't take it," she roared. She was a qualified professional. Heather dared offer her the role of a maid, cleaner, or dishwasher. Sophia jumped out of her chair and ran to the exit. She gestured to Fred. Before leaving, Fred met Heather's light blue eyes. Her gaze expressed pity. There was no past resentment or anger in that look. But there was no longer the trust that Fred had in her many years ago. She forgave the betrayal. Fred was struck with terrible remorse. The couple was driving home in a taxi. Sophia hissed angrily at her husband. She was furious that a former classmate had done this to them. She was even angrier that Muffin had become successful and beautiful. She even thought that Fred's feelings for Heather had been awakened. And Fred rode in silence. His soul was tormented with remorse. He saw and remembered those blue eyes. He knew he would never forget them again. And Fred knew he'd never be able to look at his wife with love again. In the group, no one but Emma's girlfriend spoke to her. You can say they used her for their purposes. None of her classmates respected her. His name was Jason. He was a bully. The girl rejected his attempts to talk to her, because a rich guy would never love such a gray mouse. And it was true. He had an adult interest in her. Fearing it, she constantly avoided contact. But it was hard because they were in the same class. He had no other choice but to track down Barbara's apartment. He started guarding her at the entrance. "I thought I'd drop you off at school." The girl was upset when she saw her classmates in the yard of her house. To escape from Jason, she was ready to be late for the lecture. After all, he did not miss a skirt. The girl did not want to mess with him. Barbara, the granddaughter of Professor William Johnson, did not want to embarrass her grandfather, who did not give her any privileges. although he taught her. How did he know my address? She was outraged by his behavior, but Jason continued to argue that he cared about her and had the most sincere and warm feelings for her. Listen to me, Jason. I know you haven't missed a skirt in our department, or maybe you just collected them, but that's none of my business. Her eyes were filled with fear and rage by saying these words. Poor Barbara, if only she knew what she was going through. At this time, the professor continued to lecture in a quiet, monotonous tone. His attention was drawn to the fact that half of the lecture was absent. There was no Barbara. A knock on the door interrupted the teacher. Sorry, I'm late. The old man's stern voice. Why? The girl was scared because it had never happened to her before. She always followed strict instructions, and her grandfather sat in front of her. I overslept, said Barbara timidly. Next time, set the alarm, and you get 2 additional questions on the paper as a punishment. The class laughed. The quiet one came. The boys immediately began to make silly jokes. They didn't stop even though she was the most beautiful girl in the class. She had the only friend in the department, Emma, who always came to her rescue. Everyone else did not like her because she was the granddaughter of the most famous professor. Her father and mother died years ago. She was a total orphan. Her upbringing was her grandfather. She barely had enough money to exist, so she dressed constantly in dark shades. The blue-eyed girl with blonde hair could not stand up for herself and continuously avoided noisy company. When she got to the task, she heard a voice. You're not even going to say hello? Looking back, she saw Jason sitting behind her back. Without answering anything, she went on with her assignments. The standings were difficult because her future depended on them. Emma and Barbara decided to fortify themselves at lunchtime as usual. The whole class was sitting in the dining room. A long-legged blonde approached their table and asked a strange question. Are we still on for today? You'll be home by 8 o'clock. So Barbara decided to make some money. The girl used her knowledge differently. She helped underperforming students for an extra fee. They needed homework, and she lacked money. It was all fair. Jason decided to take advantage of this, and, conspiring with a friend of Barbara's, was awaiting for her in the apartment. The tall blonde went off to the pharmacy, leaving Barbara alone with him, and Jason locked the door from inside. It ended very badly for the girl, because Jason never tolerated rejection. He attacked her and took her by force. After the incident, the girl's world collapsed into a rattle. She was afraid there would be rumors at the university. The case will be loud and will not be punished anyways. She promised herself she wouldn't say anything to anyone. Barbara did not report him to the police, as the father of the rapist was a mighty man. There was no point in fighting him. With ragged mascara on her face and pain in her heart, she strode through the dark streets, avoiding people and car headlights. In addition, that evening, Grandpa was taken to hospital with another heart attack. The doctor said he'd been rescued at the ICU, but any stress could kill him. A green-eyed Mary in a white robe suspected that something terrible had happened. She offered help, but crying, Barbara refused. At home, she tried to forget all the horror that had befallen her. The rivers of tears ran down her cheeks, but even they could not wash away the shame. For a month, the girl did not leave the house. She constantly put on a hood on the street and was hidden from the eyes. Her grandfather was discharged home. At the next tea party, the older man's attention was drawn to the fact that his vast appetite ate chocolate cake. Barbara, when did you have time to love chocolate cakes? I don't know, she answered. Because in our family, only your mother loved it when she was pregnant with you. Well, I'm my mother's daughter, Barbara grinned, but her thoughts said otherwise. She drove them away all night. The following day, she couldn't stay at home. Grandpa was discharged from the hospital. Now he was at home, so he would immediately suspect an accident and molest with questions. After a whole month of missed lectures, Barbara decided to study. She was so hoping for the support of her friend Emma. She wanted to tell her how it was going, but something was in the way of stopping. She thought it was not the time yet. She walked into the classroom and saw Jason in the company of that girls. Her eyes filled with tears of shame. She hated him, blamed herself. It was my fault, she kept telling herself, with her face gleeful and a finger pointed at her. Jason continued to tear her heart to pieces. Despite this, she continued to walk and keep her head up high as possible. Unable to withstand the pain, she fell unconscious right before him. A month later, it turned out that Barbara was pregnant. She tried to have an abortion, but the doctors did not advise her to do so because of her rhesus factor. In the future, there might be a possibility of not having children. Barbara, desperate, did not know what to do. Professor William heard about the incident from a close friend of Emma's and immediately convinced her granddaughter not to do anything stupid. He didn't care about the details, and he was glad Barbara was having a baby. When the girl's mother died in childbirth, it was because of the consequences of a failed abortion that her father forced upon her at a young age. After Eva's birth, her grandparents and Emma helped Barbara, who took care of her daughter unwillingly. She couldn't stop thinking about the circumstances under which her daughter had been conceived. She felt she was failing as a mother. One day, Jason found out that Barbara had given birth, began to intimidate them. He didn't want people to know he was the child's father. William had become witness to the scene, and his heart had broken. He had passed away. Barbara was left all alone with her child. She struggled through grief and realized she could not cope with a daughter who cried endlessly. Then, she left the stroller with Eva near the children's clinic. Along with the child, she put a note there, asking her to take care of the baby, and indicated her name. It was 7 long years after the tragedy. Barbara worked as a secretary at the bureau and was married to Simon. The man was hurrying with the wedding, but Barbara constantly stalled the process. The man felt that a concrete wall had grown between them. The bride was closing more and more against him every day. The concrete wall was her past, which the young man knew nothing. Simon didn't think she was sneaking around to watch her daughter grow up. She kept an eye on her life and gave her birthday gifts through her best friend. Emma worked at a charity foundation, so it was easy for her to see Barbara's daughter. Eva's fate was miraculous. She was adopted by the head of the children's fund, John and Mary Snow. Barbara understood the complexity of the situation. She couldn't just take her daughter away from her a few years ago. To do this, she had to take the baby by force. In order to not cause stress to the child, she had to find a way out. The woman decided to go rogue and play child psychologist and many nanny roles simultaneously. So she came into the family and started living with her little girl under the same roof, presenting herself as a child specialist. It seemed all the troubles were over, but Jason came out of nowhere. The guy came to John's house. He said he was the daughter's birth father and asked for a substantial amount of money to get rid of their biological mother. Mary Snow realized this was the only chance to get rid of Eva's biological mother once and for all. Jason conspired with Mary Snow to get rid of Barbara for a decent sum. One day in an argument, John Snow decided to kick his wife out of the house. As a result of the quarrel, Eva learned that she was their adopted daughter. In tears, she ran to her room. A desperate father threw everything into letting the young lady know he loved her madly. Mary could not understand why her husband had allowed Barbara into the house and treated her so well because she was a servant. There was no end to her jealousy. She feared Barbara would take away her husband. One night, a message arrived on Barbara's phone with an address. She drove there without slowing down. The door was left open, and when she came in, she saw Jason lying in a pool of blood, the knife handle sticking out of his chest. Frightened, she called the police. As the only witness, she was detained until the circumstances were clarified. The interrogation revealed that the prints on the knife were left behind when Jason tried to pull out the knife. Barbara wouldn't let him do it because he could have bled out and died before the doctors arrived. Even though he was cruel to her, she fought for his life to death. A small silver earring was shown to Barbara in the hopes that she was the owner of this taming. The girl couldn't remember when she saw the object. Sometime later, she called John, claiming that this jewel she saw on his wife Mary, and asked for his help. John remembered that this evening his wife was away somewhere. When she came home, she was confused and pale as snow. She went straight to the bathroom, where she spent quite a while. By juxtaposing all these facts, John began to rummage through her things in the hopes of finding a second earring. But the woman took care of it and got rid of the evidence. Out of desperation, John rushed to review his wife's photos on social media and found evidence implicating his wife. It was a deer horn earring. John persuaded his wife to confess to him during a quarrel to extract a confession of murder and clear the name of an innocent girl. At that time, the audio recording was turned on. It turned out that Mary was once again jealous of her husband, and she had planned things with Jason. He agreed. After all, the proposed amount clouded his mind, but the greedy lad couldn't resist the charming Mary during their secret meeting and plotted the same illegal acts, trying to rape her the same way. The woman broke free and grabbed the first thing she could. It was a knife. Then she sent a message to Barbara's phone, so she decided to get rid of her adopted daughter's mother and her rival. Poor Barbara, unaware of the plot between the two, rushed to the crime scene. The next day, John handed the recording to the investigator. Mary was locked up in prison. Barbara and John returned to Eva. Now their daughter's well-being was in their hands. No one stood in their way. "Hello, little girl. I know that it will not be so easy for you to forgive me." With these words, she turned to her 8-year-old daughter. Her tears seemed to choke her. She got out an album with pictures of all 7 years. With her shaking hands, she opened it. Those pictures captured her most vivid moments from the childhood of the little princess. Eva burst into tears and hung on to her mother's neck. Barbara, Eva, and John became a real family. On October 25th, Allison, a young artist's life, divided into before and after. She was informed that her parents had died in a car accident. There was a terrible accident on the road. Heavy rain and poor visibility on the road caused it. Fear, uncertainty, and sadness overwhelmed the girl. She was left alone in a big and unfair world. There were no more people she loved more than herself. She was angry, crying, and suffering. She didn't leave the house for weeks. As a child, Allison had a friend named Ron. From an early age, they played with each other and spent much time together. Their families communicated well. Ron and Allison's parents shared a profitable business. They ran a construction company. For a small town, it was a perfect business. Mothers of children were housewives. Their main interest was to attend social events. Their names were known in local circles. They were published in local newspapers, and people watched the lives of each family member. Their popularity grew every year. Their income increased. The fathers dreamed of the future of Ron and Allison and their continuation of the family business. Finally, the children grew up. Ron was immediately taken to the holding of his father. Allison graduated from the Academy of Art. She dreamed of becoming an architect since childhood. Management didn't interest Allison. Ron showed interest in the girl. He courted her, asked her out, and gave flowers and expensive gifts. But Allison didn't reciprocate with Ron. She considered him a good friend, but no more. Her heart was empty and forbidden to him, no matter how hard Ron tried. "What can I do for you?" Ron asked once Allison nervously. "You can't make someone feel something that isn't there and never will be." Allison said it very coldly, without looking him in the eye. She couldn't bring herself to love him. Allison was different, not like her family. Social events and luxurious life were of no interest to the girl. She helped children's homes, attended art exhibitions, and studied. Ron looked like his father. He was persistent, determined, and cunning. Ron was prepared to do whatever he could to achieve his own goals. Ron's father was very stubborn and could do anything for his son to make him happy. He didn't want to watch his son suffer. Dad tried to console his son, gave him many opportunities, acquainted him with the beautiful daughters of his partners, and helped financially. But all this was unsuccessful. There was only one thing in Ron's mind: Allison. Ron's family was trying to support poor Allison. The accident left a significant mark on her life. She lost hope for a promising and bright future. She was grateful to Ron's family for their care and help. She realized that she had no one closer to this family. Out of desperation, the girl agreed to accept Ron's hand and heart and continue the business with him as her late father would have wished. The girl did not feel happy. She was lost. She lived only by work and the idea that she had to continue to work for those she loved. There was no other way out. Ron and his family cared for Allison. Despite their concern, she felt alone and distant. She was like a bird in a cage she'd driven herself into with hopelessness. She never left her thoughts of her parents. She couldn't believe it had happened. Time was passing and grief remained in her heart. Those she loved were killed. The police closed the case quickly, citing heavy rain on the day of the accident. The press soon fell silent. Although the family was famous in the city, there were many moments she did not understand. She didn't figure out what happened because the accident couldn't have been an accident. Allison took all her grief on canvas. She was distracted from the world only when she was drawing. She was drawing a lot. Her paintings were all gloomy, as was her life. She shut herself down. With Ron, they lived as neighbors, even though the guy was hoping that Allison would one day respond with feelings for him. That never happened. Ron was comfortable with the love being there for him. A year passed. The firm was thriving thanks to its young heirs. One day, Ron came to his father's office and found a strange envelope on his desk. His curiosity played its role. It had all the secret data hidden from tax agents and their gray bookkeeping. He knew it could bankrupt the company. The note said, "Go to the police and admit what you did." Ron immediately went to the office to look for his father. He pulled him from the meeting and asked him for an explanation. "What the hell is this, Dad?" Ron asked. "Let me explain it at home to you tonight," Father answered. "No, I want to know right now," Ron said rudely. "Well, I've been getting these threats lately. I don't know who they are and what they want from me." Dad, but it says to confess. What do you need to confess? I don't know, Ron's father answered. Ron turned and went back to his office. He had long been tormented by thoughts of what was happening. He was trying to understand what his father could be hiding. Ron called his assistant Jack and asked him to provide him with all the company documents for the past 5 years. He checked profits and losses until late at night, suspended licenses and contracts. When Ron came home, Allison was fast asleep. He kissed her and lay down beside her. Ron could not sleep. He wanted to find out what was going on behind his back. How could his dad do something like that? Ron entered his father's office more often, looking for clues. One day, he returned to his father's, and he was not there. There was a new envelope on the table. He opened it impatiently. You rigged the accident. It was written in a note. Ron turned pale and dropped the envelope with the message. He immediately knew what kind of accident it was talking about. The young man could not believe his father could do such a thing. He was angry and confused at the same time. How could you so cruelly get rid of your friends and business partners? What was the need to do this? He had to hide the note. Ron wanted to expose his father. He started asking tricky questions about the day, October 25th. He asked his dad where he was and who he was with. He was doing his research. He didn't want his father to go to prison, but he wasn't going to let him get away with it either. After a while, Ron received a note addressed to him. It said, "You don't know your father well." Ron had suddenly lost all sense of what was going on. What was his father hiding from him? Or someone brazenly lied all this time through the letters and tried to drive his father crazy. Perhaps it was the tricks of business competitors. Then, where did the black books come from? Ron didn't want the family scandal at all. The press spread information quickly, especially if it was scandalous. Ron began to sort out his father's affairs. He stopped paying attention to his wife's business and thought less about his work. He was like a detective trying to dig up the secrets of his father. His connections helped him to find information that his father had another son with a woman. His father never mentioned his son. Ron decided to ask his mother. She was surprised and had to tell about his father's mistress and illegitimate child. It was a long time ago. You were still young. I found a letter with a photo of the baby. Your father denied that it was his child. That's all I knew. Ron was beside himself with anger. He could not even imagine that he had lived so many years in his father's lies. When his father came home, Ron threw all the notes on the table in front of him and asked for an explanation. His father was surprised and could not say anything. Why did you keep all this from me? Brother? Accident? Company scams? Ron asked monotonously. I wanted a happy family. That woman was a mistake. I didn't want to leave your mother and you. You knew about the accident. It was the only way you could get Allison. Her father was too stubborn and insistent. He did not agree to many things that would bring us profit. Yes, it was a fraud, but the business wouldn't have worked otherwise. I did everything for you. Ron turned and walked away, slamming the door. The next day, Ron waited for Allison for a long time. No one had seen her that day. It was October 25th, 2 years after the accident. About noon, Ron heard a stir in the corridor. Looking out, he saw a police squad picking up his father. He turned to Jack to call a lawyer, but he wasn't there either. When he returned to the office to collect his father's belongings, he saw another envelope. No one escapes punishment. Your brother, Jack. There were all the company's documents about transferring ownership to Jack and Allison. They were copies. Ron realized what an end their family was waiting for, and nothing could be done at the moment. He followed after his father. As it turned out, after graduating and coming to the firm, Allison fell in love with assistant Jack at first sight. Jack was later a blackmailer and secret brother of Ron's. Ron did not notice as he was investigating his father's lies. Jack eventually came forward and made the argument that Allison's parents had been murdered. He took a job at his father's and brother to avenge his mother. It was easy to find Ron's family. The family were often reported in newspapers and the press. He's been following the family's business for a long time, learning about work moments and looking for weak spots to push on. Jack had access to all the documents and was well aware of the firm's business. He waited for the right moment to destroy everything they had. He couldn't forgive a father for not acknowledging his second child. His father left his woman alone with the baby without money or help. Jack and Allison had good reasons for revenge. Everyone wanted this family to pay the price for their actions. Although Ron was not guilty of anything, he too was cunning and complex as it seemed. Ron was very much like his father. When he heard of his father's affairs, Ron did not report him to the police, which proved his nature. He could have also gone to prison for accounting as an executive director. But Jack and Allison didn't frame Ron. They put his father in charge of everything. Ron's father faced life in prison on 2 counts, a premeditated murder of several individuals and high-profile fraud. So much evidence was presented in court that the case could not be closed this time so easily with the help of his father's attorneys. Jack and Allison were able to right their wrongs and avenge their loved ones. They transferred the ownership and started the firm without fraud. Jack owned the company under the same rights as Ron. Although he was an illegitimate child, he had proof of paternity. Jack was in charge of management, overseeing company affairs. Allison became the chief architect of the holding. Her dream came true. She was doing her favorite thing. Allison donated some of her company's income to orphanages. One day, she had an idea. She wanted to auction the paintings she had painted after her parents' accident and donate all the funds to the orphanage. The auction was a tribute to her beloved father and mother. Jack was happy to support Allison and help with the organization. Soon, Allison's marriage to Ron was dissolved unilaterally, and she was able to marry Jack. Finally, Allison felt happy and loved. Her cell broke down in an instant, and she was able to take off. She was deeply in love with Jack. They had beautiful children. They looked like Allison's parents. Their lives were full of meaning. She became friends with Jack's mother immediately. She was a sweet, modest woman, much like her mother. Allison began to call her mother. Grandma spent time with the kids while the parents worked. They had a pleased and sincere family. Allison wasn't alone anymore. Ron's father had been imprisoned. Ron had taken his mother and left the country. They knew there would be no more meaningful life in this city in the past. They were never heard from again. Father was justly punished for his actions. It was a pity that he realized everything when it was already very late. After 20 years, his father got out early, but had nowhere to go. Everything he cared about disappeared because of one act. He later hung himself in his apartment. His son and wife did not come to his funeral. Maybe they didn't even know about the end of the man who once ruined their lives. Allison and Jack learned of the death from the newspapers. They visited the cemetery once a year. They visited Allison's parents. Tommy didn't hear what the men were saying, but he realized that this stranger might be his salvation. The boy began to bang furiously on the attic window and shout that he was there. Alas, the stranger did not hear him. Tommy opened his backpack and pulled out a box. That was his last delivery for the day. He was hoping Mr. Hanokin would tip. When Tommy was 19, he always wanted to eat because most of his earnings were taken by his adoptive parents. Besides, Tommy was trying to save from his meager wages. Mr. Hanokin looked like a man of wealth, his clothes and the house furnishings. The man grabbed the parcel impatiently, and there was a suspicious noise inside. Mr. Hanokin frowned and opened the box. There was a lot of shrapnel inside it. Someone deliberately smashed the contents of the package with a hammer. Tommy turned pale with fear. "Boy, do you know how much this vase was worth?" asked Mr. Hanokin. "Your life won't pay that much." Tommy was always the unlucky guy. He remembered that he was happy long ago. but it was in his childhood when he lived with his mother. But unfortunately, she died early. Tommy didn't remember her face at all, but he did place the warm hands, the scent of perfume, and her cheerful voice. "God has a wonderful parcel for you," she said when they were lucky in something. When there were a few failures, his mother said, "The parcel from God has not yet reached the address." After Tommy's mother died, he went to the orphanage, but was there for a short time. One day, a married couple, Mr. and Mrs. White, came to the orphanage. They took not only Tommy out of the orphanage, but 2 more boys and 1 girl. They chose very carefully and for a long time. Tommy didn't like the new parents' behavior. At first, the couple treated the children well, but as soon as the children grew up and were able to work, everything changed. The White family lived on a farm. They kept horses, goats, and poultry. They needed the children as a free labor force. To do this, the spouses took from the orphanage the children, who seemed to them the strongest and most enduring. Since childhood, the White couple had been busy with their adopted children. At the same time, the adoptive parents constantly told the children how lucky they were to be taken away from the orphanage, and that they would grow up as human beings. Tommy had gone from being a chubby, handsome boy to a skinny, stubby little guy. He was always looking over his shoulder, waiting to be beaten by his stepfather. His white skin had grown brown from constant exposure to the sun and poor washing. Hard calluses appeared on his legs because the children did not wear shoes in the summer and ran barefoot. Hands were constantly stained, or chicks from work with dirty water. It wasn't pleasant for the kids there. Despite his hard life, Tommy was very fond of reading. They did not send their adopted children to school, but Mrs. White taught them literacy basics. She taught them simple arithmetic and lesson. Tommy was allowed to use the home library. Although Mr. White was dissatisfied with Tommy reading a lot, Mrs. White insisted that he not touch the boy for reading. Although she supported her husband, she was not as cruel as her husband. "Do you want to go blind from books?" Mr. White grumbled and took another book from Tommy. Tommy was silent, though sometimes he thought it better to go blind than to see the ugly face of his adopted father. But the books distracted Tommy from his dark thoughts and drove him away from the scary reality. The boy learned many new things. Alas, there was no question of Tommy going to school or college. Tommy sometimes thought about running away, but where would he run to? He did not know his mother's family. She never told him if they had relatives. Now there was no one to ask. Tommy was afraid to talk to strangers because his adoptive parents would scare their ward with tales of how scary people were behind the farm. But one of the children thought otherwise and one day tried to escape. Of course, he was caught. Mr. White beat the boy severely and threw him into the building where the inventory was kept. The adoptive father closed the building and threatened the children not to look there and bring nothing to the culprit, no food or water. The frightened children did not dare to contradict. Tommy walked around the building and listened. There was only wheezing. Tommy decided and secretly brought the boy water, but his brother was so beaten that he could neither drink nor eat. After a while, the battered boy was quiet, and Tommy was scared. He realized that his brother had died, and tears covered his eyes. The terrible cry of his stepfather made him colder. Tommy hurriedly wiped his tears with his fist. "Tommy, where are you, you lousy piece of shit?" Mr. White was looking for Tommy. The boy snuck out of the building and pretended to come out from the other side. "I'm here, Father." "Tommy, you're out here. You're coming with me," said Father. But first, he opened the building and looked inside. Mr. White saw the beaten boy had died. The man slammed the door shut. Mr. White grabbed Tommy's shoulder painfully and dragged him towards the house. "Where are we going?" asked the boy. "None of your business. You need to sit quietly in the attic and come down only when I say so." The boy did not contradict. He realized long ago that any word against turns into a beating. Moreover, he was terrified of the death of his brother. Mr. White locked Tommy in the attic, and Tommy snuck into the attic window to see what was happening. He saw a car pull up to the house and a well-dressed man come out. Mr. White was very courteous to him. The men greeted him. "I'm here for Tommy. I'm told your family adopted him," said the man. "Oh yes, we've been warned," said Mr. White. "But I'm afraid you're too late." "What happened?" the man asked alarmingly. "He had an accident, volunteered to help us on the farm, and horses trampled on him. Tommy died." After a few years, Tommy grew up. Despite the meager food and occasional beatings, he became a handsome guy with piercing gray eyes. His brother and sister stayed on the farm, and Tommy begged his adoptive parents to send him to town to make money. Mr. White did not want to let his adopted son leave the farm, but his wife supported him and insisted that he had to go to work. To avoid leaving the boy unsupervised, Mr. White arranged for him to stay with his cousin. Tommy and Jack worked in delivery. Jack worked as if he were doing his time. Yes, the young man was prone to an idle lifestyle, and his father wanted to re-educate him. He arranged for an arrogant son to be placed in the most specific and lowest paid position. Jack tried to take the lightest orders to avoid bothering them too much, but Tommy took any job. He was used to working hard on the farm with his stepfather, so his current job didn't seem that hard. Although sometimes there were so many orders, Tommy would come home, eat, and fall asleep almost immediately. At least his cousin Jack had time to have fun and party all night. His uncle often used Tommy as an example, and Jack did not like it. He hated Tommy and tried to insult, frame, or humiliate him in every way. "Hey, Tommy," he said, "take another shower. The farm smell is still on you." Tommy tried to ignore Jack, but not only did Jack hurt Tommy himself, but he also encouraged his fellow couriers to harass him. They hid his ordering boxes so that Tommy would be late to order and reprimanded, tripped him up, insulted him. Tommy held back as much as possible because he knew any conflict would be an excuse to get him back to the farm. More than anything, Tommy didn't want to go back to where he'd spent his unhappy childhood. Jack's father tried to stop these antics, but first of all, he was always preoccupied with more important things. Secondly, Tommy was not related to him. From his cousin, Mr. White knew precisely how much Tommy made and demanded that he give up most of his earnings and keep only the smallest part. He always told the guy he owed him a lot because he was taken from the orphanage, fed and watered. It was only because of his foster parents that he was worth something. Tommy didn't think so, but he was still afraid to contradict. He was worried not only about himself, but of his brother and sister who stayed at home. Because if he goes out of his way, Mr. White will take it out on the rest of us. Tommy was so excited when his clients got their packages and tipped him. No one knew about the money, and Tommy was saving up a little to disappear from his adoptive parents' lives once and for all and take his brother and sister. One day, his uncle, watching the heavy box Tommy was carrying, said with envy, "My cousin made Tommy a good man, but my son is no good." When Tommy heard what his uncle said, he turned pale and barely held the box in his hands. The memories of his brutal upbringing and dead brother returned to him. Suddenly, he turned to his uncle. "Believe me, mister, it's better for Jack to never experience the proper education." Uncle looked at the young man with surprise. Tommy realized that his boss didn't know how the White family was raising foster kids and that he was using them as free labor. But Tommy said nothing to his uncle. Who would believe him? One day, his uncle called Tommy. "I have an essential errand for you. I cannot entrust this package to my son or his friends. At least I can rely on you," said the uncle. "Sure, mister," said Tommy. His uncle handed him a small box tightly sealed. "This is valuable cargo for Mr. Henokin. The address is there. I'm sure you can handle it." "I'll make it right," said Tommy. Tommy came out of the office with a valuable box. Unfortunately, Jack heard the conversation. He was furious that his father was unflattering about his son. In addition, Jack wanted to hurt Tommy badly. He called his friends and whispered something to them. The courier's friends dove according to the nod. "Hey, Tommy," said Jack. Tommy didn't want to look back. He was in a hurry to see the client and was afraid for his box. "I don't have time, Jack. I have a lot of work to do," said Tommy. "Tommy, you're overthinking me. I just wanted you to help me as a friend. Will you help me?" Jack asked. Tommy hesitated. On one hand, he had to fulfill the order. On the other, he wanted to reconcile with Jack. "How can I help you?" Tommy asked. "Help me carry the box over there. I can't do it alone," said Jack, pointing to the enormous box in the warehouse. Tommy carefully placed his valuable cargo and went after Jack. While the boys were hauling a big box, Jack's friend stole Tommy's order and opened it. There was a beautiful vase, apparently very expensive and ancient. One of Jack's friends took a hammer and broke the vase into pieces. Then they resealed the box and put it back. Tommy left with his commission, and Jack and his buddies laughed, imagining how Tommy would get in trouble. "It'll be a surprise," said Jack. "Tommy's going to cry and say it's not him," picked up one. "But no one will believe him," said the second. Tommy did not suspect anything and brought the package to Mr. Hanokin. When the man opened the door, Tommy was surprised. Somehow he thought he'd seen this man's face before. But in a short period, Tommy saw so many people in town that he could easily confuse one with the other. Tommy was handing out a package and thinking about tips when the crash happened. The man opened the parcel, and he saw the vase in the box had been mercilessly smashed. Tommy knew instantly whose work it was, but what could he prove? "Boy, do you know how much this vase was worth?" asked Mr. Hanokin. "Your life won't pay that much." But if the loss of an ancient vase saddened Mr. Hanokin, then Tommy was mentally bidding farewell to the city, the dream of getting out of the farm from his abusive foster parents. "The parcel from God didn't reach the addressee," blurted Tommy, saying his mother's favorite tale. "What did you say?" What did you say?" Mr. Hanokin asked suddenly in a shriveled voice. "I'm sorry, mister. It just popped out," said Tommy. "Repeat the phrase," said the man. "The parcel from God didn't reach the addressee," said Tommy. "My mother said when things didn't work out." Mr. Hanokin seemed to have forgotten about the package, about the vase, and he grabbed the guy's shoulder, looking up at his face. "Tommy, you're Tommy," he suddenly asked. Tommy looked at the man again and realized that he had seen him since his brother died. "Yes, I remember. You came." "Tommy, I was looking for you. And Helen, your mother. My sister was too proud, and when her fiancé left her, she didn't want us to know. It was too late when she died. I found the orphanage, but you were sent. I found a foster family, but they told me you were dead, and even showed me the body." "That was my brother's body. Mr. White killed him." "What a terrible thing." Mr. Hanokin grabbed his head. "What you've been through, Tommy." Mr. Hanokin showed the family photos, so Tommy saw his mother's face for the first time, because he didn't remember her. Going back to the farm was out of the question. Mr. Hanokin, with his connections and money, helped not only Tommy, but also his foster brother and sister. Tommy made up for the gaps in his studies and went to college, because he always had the ability and the craving for knowledge. Despite the objections of his uncle, Tommy continued to work as a courier. He was not interested in sedentary life and partying. Sometimes he would take a picture of his mother and say to her, "God has a wonderful package for you. I have everything well, and I love you, Mother."